We begin the day with an ambitious plan for Europe to seize its future now that the shackles from across the English Channel are being cast off. Now, that is one way of interpreting the message delivered today by the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker. The European Union chief sketched out a vision of a post-Brexit EU, a closer and bigger union, where everyone uses the euro and one EU finance minister runs key budgets to help member states in economic trouble. The plan is a radical one for some, a renaissance for others. It envisions federal structures and it moves the European Union, at least on paper, closer to a United States of Europe. Before he finished his speech today, Mr. Juncker said the crisis created with Brexit is now morphing into positive momentum and will soon make the British regret the day they voted yes to Brexit.
The wind is back in Europe's sails. That was Jean-Claude Juncker's key message in an at times deeply personal State of the Union speech. I've been through thick and thin with the European Union, and never have I lost my love for the EU. We all know there's no love without disappointment, or very rarely. Mentioning Brexit just briefly, Juncker used his annual speech to the European Parliament in Strasbourg to propose more help for all EU countries to adapt the euro, the bloc's common currency. He also demanded the creation of an EU finance minister, concrete proposals that were well received by many MEPs.
We are following crisis after crisis, trying to keep the European Union together. And we see now in 2017, I'm not saying everything is sunshine, but we have perhaps come out of this phase in a way that we can now actually structure the future of this European Union on a more solid basis.
Juncker also received a lot of applause for his message to Turkey. I appeal today to the powers that be in Turkey, let our journalists go, and not just our journalists, and stop calling our member states fascists and Nazis. At least for the foreseeable future, the head of the EU's Commission ruled out Turkey's accession to the EU.
It's important that we do what we say, and there are clear conditions for any country that wants to access the European Union. Frankly, the process has been frozen for years, and I think it's only honest to be open about that.
Juncker ended his speech with an optimistic note, with new trade deals and eventually new member states. Lift the anchor, as the Germans put it, and profit from the favourable breeze. The captain of the European Commission has spoken, but it remains to be seen if all the ships of the European Armada will follow.
Yeah, for more, I'm joined here in the studio by John Worth. He is a political blogger who's written extensively about Brexit, and he was with me right here at the big table in June of last year when that Brexit referendum was passed. We remember that evening very well, don't we, John?
Indeed.
It's good to have you back here on the show. First, let me ask you, as a man who grew up in the UK, as a British citizen, how did Mr. Juncker's speech hit you today?
Well, I was struck by actually how late in the speech Brexit was mentioned. It was as if the European Union is moving on. Jean-Claude Juncker referred very often to the EU 27. It's as if Britain, to a certain extent, has been marginalised, has been put to one side already. This was a speech not really targeted at the UK. It was targeted at the rest of the European Union. We're moving on from Brexit. We're moving forward. I think that was probably for his sake the right tone to strike.
Yeah.
That caused some consternation in the UK and among British politicians, no doubt.
Well, you know, there were also rumours that he wasn't going to mention Brexit at all today in his speech, but I think he changed his mind at the last minute. Let me ask you, as a resident of the European Union, as someone living outside of Britain, how did this speech feel?
It felt heartfelt, and that's very, very much typical of Jean-Claude Juncker. He believes very clearly in the European Union. We know that. We saw that in the way that he spoke today. I felt it was a relatively optimistic speech. The European Union is moving forward. It has a decent future ahead of itself. It's as if two of the major crises that have been besetting this Commission are now behind the migration crisis, and the shock of the vote of Brexit. Of course, the details are still to be negotiated. So I think there's a newfound confidence in the European Commission, and that's reflected at the level of individual citizens as well, because what we know is more and more Europeans are coming round to see the value of the European Union. There's greater public support for the European Union than there was 2 or 3 years ago. So the European Union is maybe starting to turn a corner somehow.
The vision that we heard today or saw today from Mr. Juncker is one that Winston Churchill would have supported, you know, that being moving towards a United States of Europe. But that must have sent chills down the backs of Brexiteers when they heard that today.
Right, and there were some who said, well, we told you so, that the European Union was moving in this unified direction. And Juncker talked to a certain extent about defence cooperation, for example, which is something that adds like a red rag to the Brexit bulls. So that's true. But conversely, some of what he said today, if Britain had still been in the EU, he wouldn't have been able to give such a far-reaching speech. He wouldn't have said those things in that way if he'd still been conscious of needing to essentially please British politicians with what he was saying. So it's a bit of both. I think there's a word of caution I would like to add as well. Juncker was very clear that treaty reform is off the agenda at the moment, i.e. his speech was, we are going to go as far as we can within the structures that we've got, but this is not a radical rebuilding of the European Union.
Because it would all be watered down anyway.
Right, exactly, and it would fall among member states, or it might even fall within the European Parliament. So there was a degree of pragmatism to Juncker today. There was solid vocabulary, a determination, a very political determination, but this wasn't kind of tearing up the rule book of how the European Union works.
He sounded at one point today like the captain of the European ship. But take a listen.
All of this leads me to believe the wind is back in Europe's sails. We have now a window of opportunity, but it will not stay open forever. Let us make the most of the momentum, catch the wind in our sails.
Now, when you hear that, if Brexit pulled the UK away from Europe, could you say that today that Juncker's speech was the event that pulled Europe away from Britain?
To a certain extent, I do think if it's perhaps the highest level politician who said it in that way. But if you listen to what some other politicians have been saying behind the scenes, Michel Barnier, the European Union's lead Brexit negotiator, there's been essentially a dawning sense over the summer, it's time to move on now. Brexit has got to happen. Let's get on with it. Let's have it done swiftly and smoothly and efficiently. And the European Union is moving on and moving forward. I find...
You believe that?
Yeah, I believe that's true. Because bear in mind, there was a bit of frustration with the British while they were still in, as a break on European integration.
Yeah, I mean...
and so, essentially, so having overcome that first shock, trying to work out how do you approach the Brexit negotiations, the European Union side has been well-resourced, well-organised, clear, determined. The British side, the British have been to a certain extent dragging their feet. They've not known what they want from Brexit or how to do it. And there has been this mounting frustration in Brussels going, hang on a minute, the British wanted this Brexit, but they're not ready. The EU side is unified and prepared and has a clear negotiation. And they didn't want Brexit, but they've got on and got their act together to make that happen. So if Brexit is to not happen, that is now only going to come to pass if the British change their minds. The day after the referendum, there was this kind of, will the European Union seek to keep Britain close? I don't think that is so much the case. The European Union now wants an orderly split, a split which tries to maintain some of the systems, if possible, but essentially saying, look, Britain has chosen to leave, but perhaps it is now better that Britain goes and the rest of the European Union can move on.
It's an amicable divorce, if you will.
I think that's a good way of putting it.
Let's talk about the Macron factor in today's speech. I think it was crucial for this blueprint that we saw today. Take a listen to what Juncker had to say about the French president.
I also think that over the next few months we should involve national parliaments and civil society at the national, regional and local levels in a reflection on the future of the European Union. That's why I support President Macron's idea of organising democratic conventions throughout Europe in 2018.
I mean, Juncker wants all of Europe to get on the Macron train. But, I mean, a lot of countries aren't even buying tickets, are they? Especially Eastern Europe.
I wouldn't go quite so far so as to say that that's impossible. Bear in mind that different European countries have got certain different interests in the short term, some economic, some more political. Macron's main agenda is to do with the future of the Eurozone and issues relating to Europe's labour markets and freedom of movement of workers. If he and the European Commission are clever, they can manage to pursue that agenda without getting the backs up of countries like Poland or Hungary. And Juncker's vocabulary was very clever on this today. He said, we've got to bear in mind that we can't please everyone all of the time, but if we all try and do our best to pull in the same direction, we will manage largely to succeed. We've got to listen to what each member country of the European Union wants. And so I think that if Juncker can manage to kind of corral the countries of the European Union, there's a chance of some progress, at least on the economic questions.
Okay.
The human rights questions and freedom of expression questions are perhaps more difficult.
More difficult.
Yeah.
All right, before we run out of time, I want us to listen to what Juncker said directly to the British Brexiteers. If I can tell my producer to go to the very last bite there about those regrets. Let's take a listen.
Le 29 mars 2019.
On the 29th of March 2019, the United Kingdom will leave the European Union. This will be a very sad and tragic moment in our history. We will always regret it, and I think you will regret it as well.
Will there be regrets all around?
I think there'll be regrets in the UK eventually. I think the British haven't yet come to terms with exactly what it is that they're losing. I think within the European Union, those regrets are likely to be at a more personal level, the level of individual citizens who may find it more difficult to go and live in the UK, go and work in the UK. I think at the political level, the rest of the European Union is ready to move on from Brexit now.
It sounds like you're saying that the UK, at the end of the day, is the loser here, and the EU could come out smelling like a rose.
It could. It's not a foregone conclusion yet, but it's definitely the case that Britain is going to be a bigger loser from the Brexit process than the rest of the European Union is. That is, I think, now beyond doubt.
John Worth, as always, we appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your insights. Thank you very much.